So the MMI is one of the most feared parts of the medicine application process, but there are several actionable steps that you can take to help you to smash this interview, and that's what I'll be going over in this video today. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the YouTube channel. If you don't know me, my name is Emil, and I'm a first year medical student studying at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. I just wanted to say before I get into this video, thank you all so much for helping us hit 1,000 subscribers. It has been a really long journey, and I really appreciate all of you guys who have put comments on my videos, liked the videos, and subscribed to the channel. As a celebration, I'm going to be posting a 1K subs Q&A video, so if you have any questions about me and my life, do drop them down in the comments below or follow me on Instagram to post your comments there. Alright, so let's now get into what I'll actually be covering in this video. Firstly, I'll go over what you can actually expect in your MMIs. Secondly, I'll talk about what you can do to prepare for your interviews. And then thirdly, I'll talk about what you can actually do during your interview so that you can succeed. So let's get straight into the first part of this video, which is about what you can actually expect for your MMI interviews. So since COVID is still raging on in Australia, it's very likely that your interviews will actually be conducted through Zoom. So what will usually happen is that you'll be let into a breakout room and you'll just be given the scenario and approximately 1.5 to 2 minutes to read it. And usually there aren't questions provided with the scenario. Once the 2 minutes elapses, you actually get let into the room where you'll actually be doing the interview. So it will be one-on-one with you and the interviewer, and then they'll usually ask you the questions one by one. So the interviewer is actually usually asked to be stone-faced and showing no emotion. So they'll usually won't nod, and that's never really a problem with your actual interview deliverance. The other thing that you sort of shouldn't assume is that the interview will always be based on the scenario, because often they can give you a scenario and the questions they ask might be completely irrelevant to the scenario. So let's now get into the more important part of this video, which is about what you can actually do to prepare for your MMIs. So the first thing that you should definitely do to prepare for your MMIs is learn about the interview that you'll be taking. There are several ways to do this, but usually if you look on the university's website or if you ask some people who graduated from that university, you can get an idea of what the MMI will actually be like. The things you should try to find out is especially about the timing, so how long you have to read the scenario, how long you're actually able to speak for, and maybe just a little bit about the type of questions that they ask in the interview. The next thing is one that's really important to succeed on the interviews, which is that you should always do some research about topics that are important to medicine at the moment. So in Australia, it's really important to consider rural health and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. And in addition, in medicine in general, it's really important to consider issues like sexism, gender diversity, how we care for the disabled, how we deal with an elderly population, and all of these issues that are definitely present in medicine at the moment. So make sure you actually do some research on these topics, and there are definitely more than what I just mentioned, but those are the big main ones. But firstly, find out what the issue actually is, where it comes from. Secondly, find out what some of the solutions to these issues are. And then thirdly, actually to add some more nuance, find out what some issues with the solutions could possibly be. The next thing that you should do in your preparation process is solidify your reasons as to why you actually want to do medicine. Just because it's an MMI doesn't mean you won't be asked personal questions. You can always be asked about what you've done to work in a team before, why you want to do medicine, what you think a good doctor actually looks like. And because these questions can come up, make sure you actually know what your answer to these questions are. This is where you can actually set yourself apart, because like I mentioned before, if you research certain topics in medicine, you'll realize that there are very deep rabbit holes that you can go down, and you should actually embrace that opportunity and go down a rabbit hole and research those topics and try to build an opinion and a passion for things in medicine that exist. So instead of answering in why medicine, the basic I want to help people, actually talk about one of those rabbit holes, right? Like talk about why rural health is so important and why you're eager to make change in this area as a doctor growing up. So once you've done all of these things, then you should start doing some practice interviews where you start to answer scenarios and answer these questions in front of someone else. So it's one thing entirely to research and plan your responses to these topics, but then it's another thing entirely to actually be able to articulate your answers to these topics when you're talking to someone else. It's really important to be doing time practice to make sure that you're coming across as intended, that your answers have a decent amount of structure to them, that you actually are answering and not talking too fast or too slow, that you're cutting out any mannerisms that you might not want to have during your interview. These are all things that you should focus on during timed practice. If you're able to do a lot of these things, you'll definitely be in a better spot than the person who just comes into the interview saying their personality will carry them through it. So now I'll move on to some tips that you can apply during your practice MMIs and during the actual interview to help yourself improve faster and to do better in the interview. The first thing that you should do when you get given the scenario in MMI is take a deep breath to calm down and calm your nerves. It's really important that you don't feel overly anxious and that you don't panic during the reading time that you have for the scenario. scenario, because it's actually important to use this time to get an idea of what might come up. This leads me on really nicely into what you should actually do during the reading time, which is that you should firstly try to understand what's going in the scenario. Try to understand what the key issues might be in the scenario and what key clashes might come up, and also actually try to predict the type of questions that you might be asked in the interview. Often in MMIs, what the first question actually is what would you do next? So try to answer that question as you're reading the scenario, especially if there's an obvious what would you do next question coming. So this leads me on to what you can actually do once you start answering the question. So what will usually happen is you'll be led into the next breakout room, which will have the interviewer in it. The interviewer will usually make sure you're doing okay and then actually ask you the first question. The first thing you should always do before answering a question is take a moment to listen to what the question actually is and make sure you understand what the question is, and then make sure to take a moment before you jump into your answer. It can seem like a really long time in the interview and in the moment, but make sure to take 5 to 10 seconds just to make yourself come across as calm and collected before you start answering the question. So once you get into the first part of your answer, something a lot of people ask me about is whether you actually need to repeat the scenario to the interviewer, and the answer to that is going to be no, because the interviewer has the scenario, they've read the scenario, and they know what question is being asked. The only sort of repeating you have to do might be a rephrasing of the question as the first sentence of your answer. Doing this can just give the clarity in the interview that you've interpreted the question correctly to the interviewer. So the next thing that's really important to do in the first 30 seconds to a minute of your answer is to actually signpost what you'll be talking about. So you don't have to be like, firstly, I'm going to talk about this, and secondly, I'm going to talk about this. So let's start, firstly, I'm going to talk about this, because that means that you end up repeating yourself. The only thing you really need to say is, I think there are 3 things I would do in this scenario. Firstly, I do this, give your explanation. Secondly, I do this, give your explanation. Thirdly, I'll do this, give your explanation. It's good for you to do this because it gives your interviewer a lot of context and more structure to your interview, and it also makes it clear where one point ends and the next point starts, so that they can see that you're actually thinking through things really carefully. In terms of some general tips on what you can actually talk about in your MMI, it's almost always appropriate for the first thing you do in any scenario to be to listen to the person's concerns. So in medicine, it's really important that people who are presenting their complaints or having a tough time are listened to, and that you actually take what they're saying into account. So if you're ever feeling stuck in an MMI and the scenario is what would you do next, almost always say, I'm going to listen to the person's concerns and ask them to explore them a little bit further with me. If that doesn't apply at all to the scenario, that's okay. Then you can get into the other things that you would do naturally in the scenario. In the MMI questions that you get asked, you also want to, in general, try and be as insightful as you can. So this is something that is kind of obvious for sure, but it's really important to think about what insight you're actually providing to the scenario. In general, in interviews, you want to appear unbiased and considering both sides, and you want to provide insights into why either side might be correct and why either side might be incorrect. And as a result, once you've discussed those issues, then you should come to the conclusion of what you'd actually do. That thing about being decisive is actually really important, because in real life, doctors obviously do have to consider the pros and cons, but at the end of the day, they have to make a decision. So it's actually also important in the MMIs that you do pick a side, but the important thing is that you say why you pick a certain side, and then you don't overly dismiss one side of the equation. All right, so that brings me to the end of this video about what you can do to prepare for your MMIs. If you enjoyed it, make sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel, and maybe check out this video about my best tips for interviews in general.